medical devices for use with cannabis, and natural health products and veterinary health products. And these are products that have hemp, or they're usually hemp, and contain no more than 10 ppm of THC. So what about cannabis to be used in a clinical trial? So it starts with the cannabis exemption. So cannabis, as defined in the Cannabis Act, is exempt from the application of the Food and Drugs Act unless that cannabis is sold to be used for the purposes of a clinical trial, as defined in Division 5 of the Food and Drug Regulations. So here are the regulations. Division 5 is where clinical trials are regulated. So drugs for clinical trials involving human subjects. And also of interest in the regulations is Division 2, and that's the division that governs good manufacturing practices. But we'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes. So Division 5 for drugs to be used in a clinical trial has been around for about 20 years, and it had two overarching objectives. One was to strengthen the protection for human research subjects, and the other was to increase R&D investment in clinical trials in Canada. Division 5 applies to the sale of a drug for the purposes of clinical testing in humans, independent of who is sponsoring the trial. So if it's your own drug, you're using it in a trial, it's still considered to be a sale for the purposes of a clinical trial. The division includes several definitions, two we'll talk about in a second, and it lays out all the requirements for authorization of a clinical trial. So everything you would need to file your clinical trial application. It also describes post-authorization requirements, so there are a number of requirements even after your trial is approved for any changes that you make. It gives the minister clear authority to reject, suspend, or cancel the authorization of a clinical trial even after the trial is started and is ongoing. And it also lays out all the requirements for good clinical practices and GCP inspection. So in the Food and Drugs Act, drug is defined as anything that includes a substance or mixture of substances manufactured, sold, or represented for use in diagnosis, treatment, abnormal physical state, restoring, correcting, modifying organic functions, etc. So for the purposes of a clinical trial under the Food and Drugs Act, cannabis does meet the definition of a drug. And the other definition of interest is the clinical trial. So it's any investigation in respect of a drug for use in humans that involves human subjects that is intended to discover, verify the clinical, pharmacodynamic, identify adverse events, absorption, distribution, safety, and efficacy. So it's pretty much any kind of research you can do with a drug would fall under the definition of a clinical trial. Now there are a couple of exceptions that we'll talk about a bit later, but pretty much all research is going to fall under the definition of a clinical trial. So CTAs are required for phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. They're required for comparative bioavailability studies. Now these are bioequivalent studies used for generics. It doesn't really apply to cannabis products just yet. And they're also required for a study of a product outside the parameters of the marketing authorization. So if you have a change in indication, new patient population, dose, you would also need to file a clinical trial even though the drug is marketed. So CTAs are not required for phase 4 trials. Now these are trials for a drug that is on label, but and it's used on label and it's a marketed drug. So you don't have to file a CTA for that.